Welcome, everyone, to our first Life on Tap for the fall semester, and my first Life on Tap here at the college in a non-speaking position, which is very exciting. I'm happy you could all be here. Thank you for joining us this evening. As you know, my name is Colleen Harmon, and I'm the Director of Career and Leadership Development here at the college. In the past, this series has highlighted alumni who have been successful in across career fields. This year, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We have 3 series of successful friends of the college and wonderful businessmen and leaders in the Catholic world and also in the business and philanthropy world who are going to be coming and speaking to us. So we hope that you'll enjoy that turn of events and then also join us for Career Day on November 12th, where we'll hear from the alumni. Tonight, we are honored to have Mr. Gellert Dornay join us. One of the career paths that you can take here at Christendom, despite your liberal arts major or because of your liberal arts major, is in business, which requires strong character, business acumen, faith, and an emphasis on building strong relationships. All qualities that you can do and which your degree here will certainly help you in the future to accomplish. And so we're honored to have a man who has such accomplishments here with us tonight, a man of faith. After a time at Christendom, Mr. Gellert moved to Washington State and spent 15 years building a specialty coffee company with operations on 3 continents. He is currently the president and CEO of Axia Advantage Home Loans, which he founded in 2007, a company which helps families fulfill their dreams of home ownership. And Mr. Gellert and his wife, Elizabeth, and their 10 children live in Mercer Island, Washington. And I'll let Mr. Dornay take it from here. So let's join me in welcoming him, please.
You kids are kind of young, and so it's hard to have some perception of time. But as you get older, you'll appreciate that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Maybe you've heard that. But my picture's on the door outside, and that was the same thing 25 years ago, except this time it doesn't say wanted underneath. But anyway, unfortunately for you, you were born at the worst time in the history of the world. In the last century, something around 100 million people were killed in wars fueled by greed that spanned the entire globe. More died in those wars than in all the wars that preceded them in the history of the world. In the last 75 years, contraception and abortion have become so prevalent in many of the so-called civilized nations around the world that we're not even maintaining our current population. The Japanese, the Spanish, the Italian, and now even the United States are not even replacing the current population that we have. Towns and cities are becoming vacant and family lines are coming to an end. My own brother-in-law, the only male born in his extended family that's either a practicing homosexual or decided not to have any children, and he had 3 girls from 2 different wives and decided to call it quits after that. So when he dies, his family name will end. Euthanasia is being legalized and promoted around the world and even here in our United States of America. Old people are being told they no longer are beneficial to society. They're just a big economic drain and would better serve the world if they ended their own lives. The church attendance in the United States has plummeted to the lowest level since we sent the Brits packing. We witness worldwide financial markets tumbling due to insatiable greed. Just a few years ago, it was seen as tremendously liberal for my sister's college in Olympia, Washington, to allow a middle-aged male student to hang out in the women's locker room. Not just that he exposed himself to the college-aged young women, but also to the 8th grade girls from down the street that used the pool for swimming lessons. Today, Bruce Springsteen and many, many others are flocking to liberate the oppressed LGBT community. 50 years ago, Germany ordained 500 priests in 1 year. In 2015, following a staggering 90% plummet, just 58 men were ordained to the Catholic priesthood. 25 years ago, there were 20,000 priests in Germany. Today, there are 6,000 less, just 14,000 priests in Germany. And last year, 58 were ordained, while 319 passed away, and another 19 left the priesthood. So what's the good news? The good news is that you are not dead yet. The good news is that you can do something about it. The good news is that your contribution to this specific time in history matters. God put you here right now because he has a plan for you. The good news is that you can play a vital role in the salvation of souls and help them attain eternal salvation in the presence of God. I know this seems like a lot to bear. You haven't even graduated from college yet, and the salvation of the entire world is resting on your shoulders. I heard a story from a Navy SEAL commander, a guy I met about a year ago. His name is Jocko. It's kind of a cool name. But he told me a story. You can Google him, Jacko, and he's got a bunch of stories. But the one particular story that he shared with me, I'll share with you what I remember of it. I might not have it all right, but here's what I remember. He shared about his multiple tours in the Middle East, how mission after mission he led his team to take out the targets that they were supposed to take out in incredibly challenging and difficult and dangerous situations. He and his team risked their lives in close combat, taking out militant Muslim leader targets, and often experiencing serious casualties and even death in his own team. Then finally, he was given the news that his team was to head home after this final mission. They were done. They were going to defy the odds, and the rest of them were going to make it home to see their families, their women, their spouses, their children, their kids, some of them that they had never met before. They were going to head home. Yet the night before they were to depart, Jocko was called by his commanding officer and told that he and his unit had one more mission to perform that very night before heading home the next day. They would be putting at serious risk the opportunity to return home, to see those wives, those families and friends, those sons and daughters they'd not yet met. Jocko walked out of the room and went to break the news to his team. Upon receiving the news, there was initial silence among his group. I imagine this was one of the most difficult experiences for Jocko. He was tasked with ensuring the safety of his soldiers and their return home to their families. He was so close to accomplishing this task. Now he had to tell them they may not make it back home. They might not get to see those families. At this point, I wasn't sure exactly where he was going with the story, but I started to imagine maybe a movie scene of a military burial. You don't see it these days, but people used to actually go to cemeteries to bury people. And I remembered a situation. My grandfather passed away. He was a veteran of the Second World War, and we followed this long procession of cars following these cops on motorcycles to the cemetery. And of course, it's Seattle, but it's raining. Everyone's wearing black with umbrellas on, and as the United States flag is folded up and handed to weeping family members, they're playing taps and shooting off rounds. It's a very somber event. A sad but beautiful experience. Just as a quick aside, we take our kids to funerals. Might seem kind of weird, but I think it helps them to develop a real appreciation for what life is really all about. And, of course, it is a corporal work of mercy. You know that by being good Catholic students. Anyway, one of the SEALs finally broke the silence and simply said, "Do we really have to go? Can't they send someone else?" If I were Jocko, I'm sure I would have run back to my commanding officer and begged and pleaded to pass on that trip, that last assignment. But Jocko is not a sissy like me. He's a badass Navy SEAL. And he simply replied to his team, "If not us, then who? Who are we going to send out on that mission? Who are we going to send out to risk their lives and not return home to see their families? If not us, then who?" A couple of my contemporary favorite philosophers seem to share Jocko's perspective. In response to the moral decay of our age, St. John Paul II didn't hugely chastise the atheists or the ignorant or even the evil players of the day. He said that with all this bad stuff going on in the world, this is a call to an increase in personal holiness. The answer is not to condemn others, but to instead do what we can to grow closer to God and to be an example for others to follow suit. Another recently deceased philosopher whose writings you might be even more familiar with is a guy named Michael Jackson. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and make a change. Right? Come on. You don't just listen to old Irish folk songs around here. If not us, then who? My name is Gellert Dornay, as you know. Though my dad was born in Hungary, I was born and raised in Seattle. I live on an island in Seattle, not just proverbially speaking. I live on an actual physical island in the middle of a lake. But we're practicing Catholics, and in Seattle that is something of an anomaly. Our past bishop called Seattle the Nun Zone. Initially I thought he was talking about N-U-N, for some reason. Why is this the Nun Zone? He said, no, it's N-O-N-E. In religious surveys, when you check religious affiliation, you check none. And that's Seattle. My wife Elizabeth and I were married at 20 and have been blessed with 6 daughters and 4 boys. Our eldest daughter, Kieran, is a student, not here, but at Benedictine in Kansas. And we're hopeful that all of our kids will follow suit and attend one of the great Catholic colleges of our day, like Christendom, and focus on their faith lives. So I want to share a little with you a bit about my personal story in the hopes that it might encourage you, that it might convince you that you really do matter. Your contribution to the world really does matter. Right now, pretty much your entire worldview exists within the walls of this campus. It's hard to really take in all the noise on the other side of the wall, but you need to. You need to start right now to understand what God's plan is for you, because He's calling you. He's calling you into His service. Lots of people these days talk about leadership. Everyone wants to be a leader. Everyone wants to tell everybody else what to do and to be the boss. But what God is really calling you to is service. Service to Him. Service to His people. Saint Mother Teresa didn't necessarily achieve one single huge accomplishment. She served one destitute person at a time, people none will ever know in this life. Not movie stars or politicians, but the lowest of the low. She said, "Do small things with great love." A terrific motto for all of us to emulate. How many of you have seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Like everybody, of course. Yeah. We watch it in our house every Christmas, as should you. It never gets old, and you always take more and more away from that movie. It's my favorite one in the whole world. When my wife and I watch it, we think about our children, and we sit on the couch together, and we kind of cuddle and we cry, because it is such a beautiful portrayal of the human person. And that character, George Bailey, is he really so unique? Each one of us truly touches so many other people's lives. But it's up to us if it's in a good way or in a bad way. It took me a little while to understand this concept. I wasn't just a college dropout one time. I dropped out of 4 different colleges. Not necessarily because I was a bad student, though I wasn't great. I just wasn't focused. I didn't get it. It wasn't until I met my wife at the age of 19 that I really started to pay attention and finally moved the majority of my attention past riding dirt bikes and on to happiness level 3. So some of you may have heard about the 4 levels of happiness promoted and popularized by the fantastic, amazing Father Robert Spitzer. But he talks about what motivates the human person, the human spirit. And he talks about 4 levels of happiness. The first one being the tangential, immediate self-physical gratification. I eat steak over at Tom's house because it's really good and tastes nice, right? I put a blanket on because I'm cold and it makes me feel warm. The second is ego gratification. I'm standing here behind the podium. All you guys are listening to me. This is really cool. I'm like, I'm at the peak of happiness level 2 right now. And level 3 is the move beyond the self towards the good of the other. And then happiness level 4 is the ultimate. It's doing the will of God. Easy to remember. That's how you should order your lives. Father Spitzer was actually my wife's philosophy professor and had much to do with her coming into the church. She was raised what I call flaky Jewish. Anyway, we married young, and I put my attention on my new family and my career. I had joined a startup coffee roasting company as a part-timer with the plans to move on to a real job in the near future. Affectionately titled Uncle Bob, he was something of a successful entrepreneur. This is the guy I went to work for. Though not successful in his personal life, it was full of broken relationships. He did help St. Michel Winery take off in the 80s and become a worldwide known winery and put Washington wines on the map. He ran a printing company, and he started a coffee roasting company in the wake of Starbucks' growing popularity in the early 1990s. I worked at this Thai restaurant in high school, and he let us take his cool convertible red Porsche to the dances with the girls. Us young men wanted to be like Uncle Bob when we grew up. So when he asked me to help out with his coffee company, I jumped at the opportunity. At 19, I was eager to have an impact and was quick to accept the tremendous number of tasks that Bob would hand me. I was continually given jobs I wasn't trained for, and Bob was not a good coach. But as I quickly learned, he was a serious alcoholic with a tremendous temper. He threw me into the deep end and didn't really care if I drowned. What he wanted was results. I did the accounting, the payroll, purchasing. I made lots of mistakes, and I always had great excuses. But they were just that. They were excuses. Uncle Bob did help me to look past my own strengths and weaknesses and to focus on real business solutions. He didn't care how something got done. He didn't want to hear excuses, even really good ones. He wanted to challenge me to do the more difficult thing, to find those solutions. It's easy to identify reasons some tasks can't be achieved. It's easy to sit and watch others take risks that may not come to fruition. It was an invaluable lesson to teach me about not giving up easily, but to even risk some amount of failure in achieving my goals. Though I learned to deal with Uncle Bob, I still didn't want to work for him anymore. But I loved the coffee business, and I came up with the idea to buy him out. So I went to my new father-in-law. Here I'm 20 years old. I knew he had some experience in buying and selling businesses, so I asked to get his perspective. He met Bob and ended up coming in as a partner into this coffee company. And over the next dozen years, we brought in more shareholders, more investment capital, and grew the company to a point where we had coffee roasting operations on 3 continents. After those first couple of years, I quickly got out of roasting and started working in the office, doing the accounting, purchasing, buying raw coffee beans and such. And then I quickly moved into sales. Initially, I called on restaurants and coffee shops around town, but quickly moved on to larger opportunities. I began to travel and open new geographic markets and distribution channels for the company. I called on Walmart in Bentonville, Arkansas, Hyatt Hotels in Chicago, Hilton Hotels in Beverly Hills, Starwood Hotels in New York, and many more. I then opened the international markets and set up coffee roasting plants in South Korea and the United Kingdom. I started traveling internationally in my mid-20s and was working with the largest companies in the world. During my time at the coffee company, I reported to several bosses, all of whom I was pretty critical. But one in particular I was not a fan of. He didn't drink coffee and continually watered down our product. Anyway, he implemented a review process in which I would rate myself on a bunch of different areas of performance and engagement. And he would rate me as well. And then we would talk about the differences in the ratings. The rating scale went from 1 to 10. And here I was in my late 20s, working with some of the largest companies in the world, bringing a lot of business for the company. And when it came to job knowledge and skills and performance and commitment and engagement, I gave myself a lot of 10s. He gave me 0 10s. Initially, I was pretty upset, and I let him know that, of course. And he said, "Gellert, how old are you?" 28. Is that it? Have you peaked at 28? In the next 28 years, you're not going to get better at one thing? Nobody gets a 10. You can always get better until you retire or you die. Then you can have 10s. It took me a while to digest all of that. But today it makes a lot of sense to me. I still don't like working for him. But now I have a better understanding of my opportunity to continue to grow, to continue to improve. And I did. Not just in my professional life, but my personal life as well. We were blessed with a new kid every couple of years, and their eternal salvation continues to be the most important goal in our lives. My wife Elizabeth started homeschooling with our first daughter and began her 20th year of homeschooling yesterday. While I was spending a lot of hours on airplane rides, it never ceases to amaze me how willing a fellow passenger is in sharing their life story. Initially, it irritated me not to have my quiet time away from the office and away from home, interrupted by some gal next to me wanting to share her life story. But I grew to appreciate that many people are lonely. They have no families. They come from broken families. They have no faith, and they don't know God. So I began to take the opportunity to evangelize with these people by sharing a little bit about my own personal life. You can get quite a conversation going by telling someone that you have 10 children. That is, after they've gotten back into their seat. People don't have kids anymore. Even the United States, as I mentioned earlier, is now below replacement in the number of kids we're having. People don't understand the Catholic faith and that it is truly the source of our salvation and of true happiness in this life. One of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton, which I'm sure you all read a ton of here, said, "The Catholic faith was not tried and found difficult. It was found difficult and left untried." These conversations also made me think about my job. Was I really contributing to society in a positive way? Did it help anyone grow closer to God by drinking a better cup of coffee? What about my fellow employees? Were they being treated fairly? Did they have some sense of mission in their work, or was it just a way to collect a paycheck? Was there a way to bring my faith more meaningfully into my work? We're told that there are just two options when it comes to our political economy: socialism and capitalism. On one hand, a system denies the right to private property, denies the existence of God, and puts a small group in charge of all decisions making, which generally leads to people starving to death. Not many are aware, but when China tried to centralize food production in the 1960s, they ended up with a devastating famine, and something like 40 million people died of starvation. On the other hand, we have a system that encourages personal greed. Greed is actually good. In your pursuit of economic success, you will give other people jobs and help them succeed as well. The only limitation to individual wealth is how hard you want to work, how creative you can be, and how tough of a negotiator you are. We're told that America is a great example of how capitalism is so fantastic and how it's created the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. It is indeed easy to look around and see a tremendous wealth. However, at the same time, nearly 50 million families would starve to death if they weren't on food stamps. They don't drive fancy cars and don't drink expensive champagne. I've always been somewhat entrepreneurial and, of course, support the theoretical moral platform of the so-called conservatives. But in reality, neither of these systems seem to have any good moral structure and even encourage personal vice. I met a priest who teaches in the graduate business program at not this Catholic institution, but another one called Notre Dame. I told him that I was fascinated that a Catholic priest was teaching a graduate level business program, and inquired as to what area he focused on and how he brought his Catholic faith into the classroom. He told me that his specialty was negotiation. And he continued to tell me about supply and demand and pricing elasticity and how to negotiate a better deal. This, of course, is not the answer I was hoping for. And I further asked how virtue is brought into getting the upper hand on the lesser party. He tried to change the subject and quickly found another conversation to participate in. In speaking with fellow committed Catholics about business, I found two common responses. The first was that business was pretty much evil, about making money and forcing people to buy things that they really don't need. But I need to earn a paycheck, I have to feed my family, so I'll punch the clock from 9 to 5 while I'm plugging my nose and go home and pray a rosary with my family. The second response was, yeah, business is kind of slimy, but that's just the way it is. We can't change that. So I'll go ahead and participate in this economy. I'll make as much money as I can, and I'll give a few bucks away to some charity, to people that can't feed themselves, and then I'll feel better about it. A similar position was held by Winston Churchill. He said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the rest." Of course, neither of these is a good solution to settle on. And as I'll get to in a moment, the church makes it quite clear that both systems are inherently problematic. I joined a Catholic business leaders group in my late 20s. The mission of the organization is to support the business and personal formation of the members and spouses in light of our Catholic faith. The qualifications to join the group are pretty extensive, and most of these members were in the latter stages of their career running large organizations and over twice my age. I was hoping to learn from them how they had successfully lived out their Catholic lives in their business world. But what I found out was most of them were coming back and rediscovering their Catholic faith after a number of years in the twilight of their careers. I never thought much of economics. I passed my econ classes, but I don't remember much about them. But now here I was, spending the majority of my waking hours engaged in our economy and perplexed at how my Catholic faith played a role. The business decisions I was involved with in the boardrooms of the companies I worked with did not seem to take any sort of ethics into consideration. We discussed product features, customer demand, and profit margins. We talked about maximizing shareholder value. It all seemed a little shallow to me. I met a fellow younger guy in this business group I had participated with who was feeling a similar way. Together we started to look into what the Catholic Church had to say about business, if anything at all. We discovered something called Catholic social teaching. I had heard of the term before, but thought it was about giving bread to poor people, and an excuse by liberals to take from those who've worked so hard for their bread and give it to a bunch of lazy deadbeats. This continues to be a common misunderstanding. I recently hired a graduate from Seattle University, Jesuit school in Seattle. I took him out to lunch, as I do with a lot of our new employees. We have 300 employees, and I try to spend some personal time with them, get them to know about my thoughts on the world, etc. And somehow we ended up talking about Catholic social teaching. I don't know exactly how the conversation came up. And he said, yes, I know about Catholic social teaching. I've had 8 years of Jesuit education. It's about giving bread to poor people. And I said, but you're a finance major, right? How were these principles of Catholic social teaching brought into the classroom? Yeah? No. I always thought that was kind of weird. But of course, there's much more to it than feeding the poor. Another example to frame this dynamic comes from Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm sure you'll read some of his works as well. He wrote Democracy in America, his most famous book, but a lesser-known book he wrote, a small one, is called On Pauperism. He visited Britain in the mid-1800s and saw industrialization in full swing. He saw huge factories and fancy carriages and fancy operas. But he also witnessed a growing segment of the population that was living below subsistence. They couldn't feed themselves. Men had had their homes in the country. They left them for the promise of more consistent work in the factories. They got laid off for whatever reason. And as they have no ownership in the company, no ownership in their homes, and no family around to fall back on, they now had to rely on the government or private charity to eat. Alexis also went to Portugal. There he didn't see the huge factories, he didn't see the huge carriages or attend the fancy operas, but he didn't see a class of people that couldn't feed themselves either. Pope Leo XIII saw the same thing happening a few decades later. He further noticed that not just the financial problems, but the moral problems that followed as well. Families were split apart, and red light districts were popping up. The first encyclical he wrote to address this new economy was Rerum Novarum in 1891. He noted the growing imbalance of capital and labor. Capital was demanding a higher return, and a return ahead of labor. Today we hear about the primary obligation of a corporation is to benefit its shareholders. Really? Does that seem to be the best thing for our society? I'll share a story with you about what this looks like in action. We sold our coffee company in 2006. Though I was a shareholder, I was not a member of the board and didn't know much of these particulars until recently. So this is not my fault. This is somebody else's problem, right, that they created. A stock option plan had been put together to incentivize many of the managers and employees of the company. This is really a good thing. Broad distribution of ownership, or even just profit sharing, are a great way to pursue a more reasonable balance between capital and labor. Anyway, our board negotiated the option to roll the interest forward in the new combined entity as we were merged with another coffee company. Now the company had its own coffee plantations in Central America, processed its own coffee, imported its own coffee into 3 continents, where it had roasting operations and distribution. The control of the entire supply chain was really cool and of tremendous value to the large customers we sold to that wanted to ensure sustainable farming techniques were being used and education and medical treatment were available for the families that lived and worked on the coffee plantations. So it looked like the future prospect of the new company would be really fantastic. And it wasn't just an opportunity created for the employees to roll their interest forward, their shares forward into the new combined entity. They were offered a number of equal shares on the margin. This means that employees don't actually have to pay the current price for the stock. They were essentially lent the money to buy the stock and then would sell the shares in the future at some higher value, pay back the loan, and keep the difference. So you'll learn more about buying on the margin as you get older. Be cautious. So all the employees rolled their stock forward in the company, except for one, except for me. I didn't want to work for the Wall Street firm that now had control. I didn't trust them. I was the only one that left. So fast forward 7 years later, the company sells to the largest tea company in Japan that wanted access to the grocery markets in the United States and in Europe. The sell price was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. However, the company had amassed so much debt in its appetite for quick growth that after that debt had been paid off and the preferred shares of the Wall Street firms realized there was no value left in the lower class of shares held by the employees. They did not just lose the original value of the stock they rolled forward, but now they owed the company the loan they had in buying the next group of shares. Of course, the company was very generous and waived the debt. So these employees have been working for as much as a dozen years or more in the hope of having some payoff down the road. These are not independently wealthy people. This has been a large part of their retirement, and they ended up with zero. Unfortunately, this is not a rare example of what happens today. So when the church sees problems going on in society, she slowly but eventually helps to address them. Thus, a series of encyclicals, starting with Leo XIII and the subsequent popes thereafter, have provided us with these so-called principles of Catholic social teaching. These include the idea of the common good. A business should only sell products or provide service that are really in the long-term best interest of the communities and customers that it serves. Solidarity, just wage, preferential option for the poor. You take a situation of, I hired a gentleman recently who had been a pastor for many years and was trying to learn a new trade. He had a wife and 3 children, but he had no skill sets for what we were offering. And he accepted an entry-level position along with, we had 2 openings. Another was a college girl that was living at home. And here I was faced with the prospect of paying both of these people the same wage. And here one guy is providing for 5 people, and here's one gal that's spending money on shoes. You know, what obligation do I have to help pay this person a just wage? The individual is not the basic unit of society. The family is the basic unit of society. The Pontifical Council for Peace and Justice has published the Compendium on Social Justice. There's some great teachings in here which are truly obligatory for us Catholics to understand and to incorporate into our businesses. So when I helped found Axia Home Loans in 2008, my partner and I committed to these principles in how we built and ran our mortgage operation. And 9 years later, we are instituting an employee stock ownership plan and giving up our ownership. This is not an exit strategy for me, as I'll continue to run the business for the next 5 to 10 years. But the employees will get the company's profits that would otherwise go to the shareholders. And my goal is to, instead of selling the company to some Wall Street firm that would fire half the staff and likely run the business into the ground, to instead give the profits to the 300 employees and provide over $100 million in retirement income they would otherwise never see. So don't listen to what the world tells you about leadership and amassing wealth at the expense of others, but store up your real treasures where the rust and the thieves can't get them. Commit your life to the service of God and His will in all that you do. Not just on Sundays for an hour, but each and every hour, even after you punch the clock at the office. As I like to tell my children over and over and over and over again, the world needs you. Souls need you. Go out and maximize your positive contribution to the world. And when you do die, may the first words you hear be, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. Come into the joy of your master's house." Thank you.